Hey everybody, welcome back to the Words of Life channel and episode 2 of our 2024 podcast with my brother Kevin Baruni. We have begun to study the Book of Colossians last week, and we're starting in probably verse 12, 13, 14, somewhere around there of chapter 1 of the Book of Colossians. Super excited you could join us again this week, Kevin, and for those of you tuning in to listen and to study the Word of God with us, we're very excited to do this for our own benefit, and we're hoping that you get a lot out of it as well. Just to kind of recap what we started with last week in the book of Colossians, written by the Apostle Paul, written to the church in Colossae. And this was a church that he had never personally visited. And so when we read this book, it's almost like he's writing it to us, because we also don't have a personal relationship with Paul. He doesn't know us. So the advice and the wisdom and the instructions that he gives, I find to be that much more applicable. What do you think, Kevin? You want to help me out recap our study from last week?
Yeah, I think we kind of just started in, where Paul is really getting into these prayers for the Colossian church, like he typically does in his letters, right? It's pretty standard that he'll say the things that he's praying for them for. And there's this idea as he's talking about that the things he was praying for them for was these things he's heard about them, right? The good things he's heard about them. And the fact that he's heard, and he makes this connection to this fact that the gospel is sort of growing in them. And as it grows in them, it also grows in the world, at large. So there's that connection there between, if we want the gospel to spread and grow in the world, it's got to be growing in us as well. And then he kind of continued. I think we left off last time sort of reading, 11 through 14, and we just kind of started talking about 11 and 12. Where he prays for this continued growing knowledge of God's will, right? That they continue to grow in the will and knowledge of what God wants, so they can be pleasing to him. And this idea that he prays for their strength of God's glorious might. So all the might that God has, he prays that would be in you. But then that purpose of that might is not so we can go out and bully other people around. It's so that we can remain patient and steadfast. It takes all the strength of God in order for us to be patient and steadfast in this world, because of all the different things that are thrown at us. And so that's kind of where we're thinking about were those ideas, and then really get into the end of that prayer section there. Where he starts to talk about them being, this really exciting thing, right? That he's thankful for, that we'll get into here in verse 12. So,
all right. Well, that catches us up. Let's get the text up here. I'll get the logo out of the way this time. All right. So just go ahead and read this again, just so we have a little bit more context. Starting in verse 9 there, it says, "And so, from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power," which was Kevin was just talking about, "according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." And we'll just go ahead and stop right there, because we need to finish up that last section of that first paragraph there. So we talked last week about the fact that there's this progressive growth that we're talking about here. That it involves increasing in knowledge, right? So, and how do we do that? Well, we do that by engaging in acts just like Kevin and I are doing right now, where we're diving into the Word and we're studying it. We're really trying to analyze it and try to pull out as much as we can and see where we may be weak in our lives, where we have weaknesses, where we have deficiencies perhaps, or habits that we're trying to break, and to mold ourselves into being more Christ-like all the time. And of course that also comes with Thanksgiving. So there's always these coupling things going on. So we have endurance and patience and joy, but being thankful all the time while we're going through these trials. I know we talked about we didn't talk about it, but James talks about going through trials and being joyful because of the we know the outcome of getting to the other side of that is that we're going to be better for it. So
Yeah, and there seems to be this sort of connection here that he's making, right? That they have this patience and steadfastness that they need, right? But then he immediately turns around this idea of giving thanks to the Father who qualified them to share in the inheritance of the saints, right? So there's this connection between, patience and steadfastness and enduring, and that somehow being an indication or a sign that something is different about us, right? That we have been qualified to share into the inheritance, that we have been rescued from the domain of darkness, right, and brought into this kingdom of Son. So that connection always seems to be there with, the things that you're getting, the goodness that God is blessing on you is going to also result in some sort of troubles from the world, right? And I think that lines up nicely with what Jesus was telling his disciples when he was here, right? Don't be surprised when they persecute you and do these things to you. The servant's not greater than the master. If they did it to me, they're certainly going to do it to you as well. And so we see that playing out here as well. This idea of you got to be patient and steadfast, and look at all these great things you have, right? As though those two things are connected in that way.
Well, it's interesting that the fact that he used the word qualified.
Yeah.
Right. There's an implication there. There are certain segments of the Christian world that teach a little easier path to find redemption, right? This kind of a once saved, always saved concept that has seemed to come and ebb and flow from time to time. But the fact that there's a qualification involved doesn't mean that it's just free for everybody, right? There's obviously something that you have to do in order to be qualified to share in the inheritance. And what do you think that inheritance is?
Yeah, that idea is interesting there, right? That this idea of being qualified to share, and I think there's certainly implications in the text here that talk about being pleasing to God, right? That what we do is pleasing to Him, that we walk in a way that's worthy, that we act in a certain way. And here it's this idea. It seems like if I'm understanding the words correctly, that God has done something in this instance, right? God has qualified us. We on our own are insufficient, right? We're unfit. We're not able to meet the qualifications to share in the inheritance, but it takes the work of God to do something to make that happen in us, right? And certainly there's a piece that they end up playing, right? This idea they received the gospel, this idea that it's growing continually in them, that they're walking in a manner that's worthy of the Lord and being pleasing to Him in all respects in verse 10, right? And the focus here is really on that God has done something. We could do all those things on our own, and even still, we wouldn't be qualified, right? Without God intervening on our behalf through what He does in Jesus. And that's kind of what He's saying here, that we are now qualified. We're worthy. And again, it's not because of what we've done. We're sufficient, right? Where we're rendered fit in order to share in the inheritance, right? And that inheritance of the saints of light. And I think what that inheritance is, he's going to talk more about it later, but we see a beginning of it here, right? That we are able to inherit because we're now in the kingdom, right? So the inheritance itself is going to talk about a little later, but here we're qualified because we're an heir at this point, right? And so previously we were in the domain of darkness, it says in verse 13, and so we were not qualified to receive any of God's inheritance because it's for His family, right? And we weren't part of that kingdom. The king doesn't give his inheritance to outsiders, right? He gives it to those who are within the kingdom. And so, he and that's the thing He did. He qualified us by rescuing us. He pulled us out of that domain of darkness. He brought it into that kingdom of the Son. And there's that idea of inheritance again, right? The Son, whom He loves. And so, Him doing that, Him rescuing us, that's sort of the thing that, Paul is really giving thanks for, right, to the Father, that, hey, not only did He do it for me, Paul and Timothy and us, but He also did that for you. And so you now can share in that as well, right? Which I mean, Paul, I think, is obviously thinking about that just in general, but it's also got to have some added meaning to him from his sort of Jewish perspective, right? That you all are Gentiles, and he has qualified you to share as well. Whom, if you'd asked Paul at the beginning of his life, he would have said, "You have no part in this," right?
Right.
And now he's so thankful that all of these people as well, who he thought were always on the outside, are going to be brought in.
Well, I think that you talk about inheritance just in general, right? When we think of an inheritance, we normally associate that with children and parents, right? And so us being qualified to share in the inheritance, there's and there's other passages that talk about this in more detail, but there's a real adoption that's being taken place here, where God has reached out and says, I want you to be my children, right? And if you want all of the things that I offer and all of the blessings and benefits of my kingdom and my world, which is heaven, then you have to be my children. But there are qualifications, right? I expect things from you. So yeah, I mean, because nobody expects to inherit somebody else's parents' stuff,
Right.
right? So you kind of got to get in the family in order to qualify to inherit, that. Hebrews talks about, the death of the testator, the first covenant and the second covenant, right? That sort of a thing. So it's a very real applicable principle here that we need to be adopted children of God, and to be that's one of the things, so.
Yeah, and he's going to talk about that in terms of his own body, really, right? As you get down further in this chapter, in verse 22, we'll get to that in a minute. But this idea that he's reconciled you into his body, right? He's made you part of the Christ, right? And so it's a very real sort of thing that's happening, right? In the terms that are used, it's not just some right? It's something that's occurring in a spiritual way, but is very real in the terms that are used, right? That the transformation that's happening. And we'll see that transformation talked about here too, that they were once alienated in the way they behaved, but now they're holy and blameless and beyond reproach and those kinds of things, because of what he's done. And as long as you stay firmly in the faith, then, you're golden effectively, right? You've got these things, because of what he's done. And that term of adoption, the term of being part of the body, all those terms are things that he's going to use to try and drive that point home. And I think it really gets into, as we get further, sort of what this mystery is that he's going to reveal. I don't want to spoil it too early, but the terms he's using here will lead towards that mystery, right? The thing that he's trying to get to them to understand. So
exactly. So when we think about this concept of being delivered from the domain of darkness, it's really easy just to think of that as only eternal spiritual residence, right?
Sure.
But in a very real way, as Paul continues to break out this book and all the instructions, the practical way of living in this age, in this world, in this body, when we are fully inheritors of all the blessings of God, we are also delivered from the domain of darkness that exists in this world, this present existence. So you got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. As we get down further, like I said in the text, and in like 21, especially, he's going to talk about that you were previously alienated and you were hostile in your attitude. You were engaged in evil deeds, right? That's how you were before. And so that directly ties to this idea that if I say, what does it mean to be in the domain of darkness? There it is, right? Yeah. I was alienated from God. I was hostile in my attitude towards him. I was engaged in evil deeds. And he says, I've rescued you from that. And now he's saying, you previously were those things. Well, that's not just an eternal down the road kind of a thing. That's stuff that I was doing in my own life now, right? That he says, you don't have to be slave to those anymore. And Paul will talk about that in Romans in that way, right? That these things that a war against me, I don't have to be enslaved by those things because I've been delivered from them by God, right? By what he's done. So I don't think it's just a future state, right? It's a very real thing that he's saying you experienced, right? There's a transformation he'll talk about in the Colossians for sure.
Absolutely. So we've been delivered from the domain of darkness and then transferred. So there's always, the cup's always full with Paul, right? You take something out, he refills it with something better, you know. And especially get to chapter 3, there's a whole bunch of, you know, taking away, but fill it up with something
Yep.
better. And then he transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom, that means that's Christ, in Christ we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. For the people of this first century era, was forgiveness of sins something that was commonly talked about?
You know, it's hard to say, right? I mean, we clearly have this idea when Jesus is around, right? One of the most famous examples when this is discussed is, you know, when he's going to heal the man that they bring for him that's paralyzed, right? And instead of healing him, he says they lower him down through the thing, right?
Yep.
And he says, "Rise up, your sins are forgiven." Right. And then everyone there goes, no one can forgive sins except God alone. Right. So clearly there was this idea that forgiveness of sins existed, but it almost seemed like out of the reach of mankind to achieve. Right. God can do it. And we understand through the law and the sacrifices and the offerings that we make, we're doing the things that God has said. But there's also, I think, a very real understanding on their part that this is not sufficient. The Hebrew authors you mentioned a little while ago in that same section, we'll talk about in those offerings year after year, there was just the reminder of your sin, right? There, you knew that this was not good enough to atone for what you had done. Exactly. And so, it's this idea of, you know, the forgiveness of sins. And then when Jesus comes on the scene and starts going on saying, I have the power to forgive sins, right? It's heresy effectively, right? To the Jew that hears it. And, you know, what that would have been like to a Gentile is interesting as well, right? It's hard to say because there's so many different ideas in what we'll call paganism at this time, right? About, you know, what is sin? Is it even a thing, right? I mean, I can displease the gods, right? But is that a moral thing? Or sometimes it was just, Zeus doesn't like me because, right? You know, or you have stories of, you know, the Medusa story, right? You don't like me because I'm prettier than you, right? Like it wasn't a sin. I just displeased you. So, you know, in the Gentile mind, it's hard to understand about what that is. But, and so I think that's part of the early Christianity spread, is even getting these people to understand that they're alienated, even getting them to understand that there is a creator against whom they've sinned, right? That is displeased with them. And then getting them to understand, and you don't please him by going and making all these offerings and sacrifices and doing these things at the temple, right? That's not how you please him. He's already done the thing necessary. And you've just got to get in line with that. And so that would have been a very interesting, I'm sure, and radical idea to Jew and Gentile alike in that day.
Well, I think that, 2,000 years later, the concept of sin may not necessarily be as radical, but it's no longer really talked about as much as it was probably 50 years ago. You know, people understood that there were certain things you just can't do, and those were also called sins, right? Now, while people's morals may still be relatively on track with what's right and wrong, maybe not society in general these days, but people understand that it's still wrong to lie, it's still wrong to steal things, it's wrong to murder, right? I mean, all of those real basic human moral codes are pretty stable, right? But the correlation between those and actual sin, because there was somebody who made the rules, the creator made those rules, right? And to go against them is to go against the creator, right? And so that the concept of sin, I think, something that probably should be talked about a lot more. The fact that we all sin, and what the consequence of sin is living in this domain of darkness, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you're onto something there with this idea that, you know, we've separated the divine, right, or we've removed the divine in our modern society, and so while things may be wrong I mean, it can't be sin unless there's a God against whom I trespass, right? We don't call it sin because sin suggests that there is a creator, there is someone divine, right? It's just, that's wrong because it's morally reprehensible. That's wrong because it, devoids another person of their life, right? That's why it's wrong. It's not sin because sin assumes there's a God. And so when you remove a God, right, remove God from the equation, then we don't talk about sin in that way as much. People don't talk. They'll say something's wrong, but they won't call it sin. Yeah, because it's religious, right? In its very nature. That term is religiously loaded up in its very nature. Yeah.
Exactly. So, in Christ we have redemption, and we can have the forgiveness of our sins. So, but we have to be in Christ. We have to be an inheritor of the blessings of God. So we have to be in the family and qualified through Jesus. And now he's transitioning into talking about Jesus. And I really love this next section and beyond, because it really is arguably one of the most comprehensive pro-Jesus passages in the whole Bible. You've got 1 John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1. I think they're kind of rank up there equally. I mean, at least from my perspective,
Yeah, and you can even see here in the version you've got up on the screen, right? These subheadings that get put in by the translators, right? The preeminence of Christ. Like this section is about that, Jesus is before the first of everything, right? And he's going to list all of those things that follow here. And if you want to know who is Jesus, right? And I don't mean like who is he personally. Go read the Gospels if you want to understand about Jesus, right? But if you want to know like who is Jesus really, right? Who is the Son really in the cosmic scheme of things?
Right.
This is where you go, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you could argue that the book of Hebrews, the entire book,
it's about his superiority to these. It's
about Jesus being better than everything,
Yeah.
But it takes 12 chapters to find, or 13 chapters to, really understand all of it.
Yeah.
Where here is just in a really short, concise manner, you really get a lot of oomph.
Yeah, it's what we call in my my business world the elevator pitch, right? This is the Jesus elevator pitch for his preeminence, right?
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to all the dissertation of Hebrews explaining how he's superior to this, that, and the other, right?
Yeah. Whether you believe Paul wrote Hebrews or not, it's certainly a court-like case for Christ, right?
Yep.
Especially for from the Jewish mindset. But all right, so back to our passage here in Colossians. We pick it up in verse 15. We'll go ahead and read just these few verses. The context obviously continues on, but it says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Obviously a lot to unpack just in these 3 verses. But I'll let you take a first stab at it.
Yeah, right. I mean, as we start digging in here, I oftentimes, when I will break this passage up, right, I'll oftentimes put 14 down at the start of 15, right, as it starts talking about Jesus, because that's really the get-go, right? We have the redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He who Jesus, right? The one we were just talking about. He is
beloved son, right?
The beloved son, right? The beloved son is the one that we have to see from verse 13, right? He's the one whose kingdom we reside in now. And so now it follows after that setup there, that it's his kingdom, he's the beloved son, is just his greatness and blessings, right? Like this whole section is now talking about the king, right? The beloved son. The ruler of the kingdom. Here's all the blessings and greatness that he's about, right? Starting sort of that forgiveness of sins back in the previous verse. But here, we get this statement that he is, it's really this idea that he's the exact visible representation of an invisible God, right? Yeah. And that's important because what he had just said and what we talked about a minute ago is, what does he do? He forgives sins. Well, why can he do that? because only God can forgive sins, right? That's what the Jews correctly said in the days of Jesus, right? And he didn't say that's not right. He went and said, well, let me show you I'm God. And that's what's happening here. There's forgiveness of sins in him. Well, how? Because he is the exact visible representation of the invisible God, right? So of course he has the right and the power to forgive sin, because he's the one whom we sin against. And then he begins to really go into this idea that he's going to set up how great is he, right? Over what is he? And so he starts with the idea that he created all things, right? All things were created by him. And what things, right? Well, the invisible things, the visible things, the heavenly things, the earthly things. He encompasses all of those things, because again, his sort of idea, the preeminent Jesus, is to lay out how great this king is, how sufficient this king is. And that's going to be important as he kind of develops his argument. We talked a little bit about there's some sort of false teaching maybe beginning to go around. And what Paul is trying to begin to establish is you don't need any of that, because Jesus is everything, right? If he's the head of all, if he created all, what didn't he create? Right. As he moves into the next section, he's the head of all. What is he not the head of? Right. Is sort of the question we might ask ourselves. And we see a similar idea there, as you mentioned, 1 John in the Gospel of John, right? 1:1-3. We see that idea, right? In the beginning was the Word. He was with God. He was God. There it is. He's the visible representation of the invisible. By him, right?
Down in 14 of John 1, it says, and the Word became flesh.
Yeah, and dwelt among
men, right? He became a man, the same creator of the universe, put all of his deity into a human body.
Yeah. And that's
humbling himself,
To me, that's a really fascinating idea. That gets overlooked, and it's important to the Colossian letter. And so we'll get into that a little later, but if we sort of put a footnote in that and hang on to that idea, right, that all of the invisible God was able to dwell in bodily form, right? And he came here and he lived here in the temporal world, is going to have real ramifications for the mystery that Paul is going to reveal, right? It's really going to be like, oh, right. When we sort of understand that, but here, he's really laying into that he is God. Right, he's his image. He's the firstborn of all creation.
When I think about that first verse 15, you were talking about the embodiment of God, right? The fully realized embodiment of God, physical representation. I'm reminded of what Jesus said in John chapter 14, starting in verse 6. He said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Like, he is the gatekeeper, the door to God, access, right? He is the access point. If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Right? So when Paul says he is the image of the invisible God, right? Which means he's visible through Christ, right? Anyway, that was just a verse that popped into my head when we were talking about, the fact that Jesus made the claim, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Yeah, when the disciples say, "Show us the Father and we sufficient." What are you talking about? Have I been you this long and you're still asking, "Show us the Father?" Right?
I've been with you 3 years. Right, you still don't get it,
Yeah.
Yes. And the fact that, so I forget who it was, is back in the 70s, I think. But the concept of Jesus is either a liar, a lunatic,
or Lord,
or the Lord, right? So those are the only 3 options you have, right? He was either a crazy guy, right? He was either just a bold-faced liar, or his claims are accurate. He was the Lord, Those are the only choices you have. When you're considering Jesus.
Yeah, and Paul's position on that is pretty clear, right? Here in the Colossian letter, especially, and as we get down even to 18, he'll continue to demonstrate that he's Lord, right, over not just all the universe, right, but some important things to us as well, right? Sometimes we think about this thrones and dominions and heavenly things, and you're like, okay, I don't know what's happening on the other side, so what does that matter to me whether Jesus is running it or not, right? But he's going to get very real for the Colossians here as he keeps moving down through that. So,
well, and then the claim that he's the creator, but then verse 17, he is before all things, so the eternal nature of him, right? So you have this timeline that goes that we just can't comprehend. Eternal in the past, right? There is no beginning. There is no end. When God told Abraham, or Moses, Abraham, I am. Tell them I am sent you, right? Was it Moses?
Moses.
Sorry, it was Moses on the way to Egypt.
Egypt.
Yeah, and the burning bush and the whole, right? It says, well, who do I say sent me? Say I am. And the implication of that is, of course, that I am, present tense, eternally, right? Yep. But in him all things hold together. So he made the rules, he keeps it going, he keeps us going, So there's a lot there. You want to move on to the next little section there?
Yeah, let's.
All right. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. So we have here the continuation, obviously, of the preeminence of Christ as the the transcribers have put in there. I think it's an appropriate title or heading for this section.
Yep.
Because it says that in everything, he, Christ, might be preeminent. Preeminent meaning there is no greater, period.
Yeah, and it's interesting what's happening here. When I sort of look at this, when I take just a step back, just a little step back, not a big step back, and I look at this whole section together, right, from 14 down through about 21, right? Let's say 21, 22. It's really interesting what's happening, right? Because we start off with this idea that he creates everything, right? He's created everything. All the things in the heaven, all the things on the earth, he holds them together. They were all created by him and for him. Then as you keep moving on now, he's going to talk because he's created all things, that makes him the head over everything, right? It gives him, because I created it, I get the rights of determining what does and what does not and what its disposition is because I'm its creator, right? But he starts narrowing it, right? That includes being the head, not of everything, but also of his own body, the church, right? And what you start to see happening, it'll continue even down into the next part of 21, 22. It started with this, what I call this growing narrowness, right? And what I mean by that, it's like a funnel. So he starts with the heaven, the invisible things, then the earth, then the visible things, then the church. And he's going to keep driving down to the next verses to you personally, right? So it's he takes it from this place of, which we sometimes do, right? That, God is up there and he's so great. And he's so great, maybe he doesn't impact my life because I'm so far down, right? Right. Because we think of God as like the king or the president. And the president maybe he's something, but he doesn't know me personally, right? So I can get away with stuff because I'm so far down the chain, right? And so Paul does that. He narrows that down to this idea that he's the head of all things, including the church, right? Not just the world at large. He's going to have the first place in everything, and he's going to keep narrowing it down to that means what? Well, me too, right? Is sort of what he kind of gets down to. And Paul puts himself there, of which I became a minister, me personally, right? Right. And so there's this narrowing of scope from the great grandness of Jesus, but that great grandness applies in your life as well, right? Yep. don't think because you're so small that he doesn't have authority over you also. Is
Yeah.
kind of what he's driving down to there.
No, that's great. I think it's really important when you all are studying the Bible to make sure you keep the greater context in mind, so you don't get too lost in the weeds, which is easy to do sometimes, especially with one of Paul's letters. He is not always the easiest writer to understand. So it's a good observation. Thanks.
Yeah, right. And it's interesting the way he does that in each section, right? So he's sort of the head of all things because he created them, right? Then you get down to he's the head of the body. Well, why is the head of the body? I mean, we could say he created it. That's true. But he's the head because of the resurrection, right? He was the firstborn. He made the body of the raised dead, right? Which includes us in a spiritual sense, as he's going to get into here. And so because he created the body by being the firstborn, he gets to be the head of that, right? And so it's not always just, well, Jesus is awesome, and so of course he gets to be the head, right? He goes to lengths to detail, why he has authority in these specific things. He created the body in the resurrection. He's the first from the dead, so he's also the head of the body because it's his body, right? And then we get to that thing that you had pointed out to or alluded to before there in verse 19. Right, that it was the Father's good pleasure for all of the fullness to dwell in him, right? We talked about that idea of him being the image of the invisible God. And we talk about, that the Word was with God and the Word was God. He created all things, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And John, that's what we're seeing here as well. Why did that happen? Because it was God's good pleasure, right? That's how God wanted it. It pleased him to do that, to put all of himself, to put all of the divine into Jesus. Jesus gets to preeminent because God likes it that way, right? It is a really interesting idea. And it lines up really nicely with what Jesus said when he was here, right? Over and over and over again. If you just ask Jesus, what's your mission? What are you doing, right? It's to do the will of the Father, right? That's my job. That's what I'm here. I'm here to do the Father's will. I'm here to please God. That's it, right? And when we really see that, the why maybe of that happening here in Colossians.
So, I, like most people, if you think about the why of the universe, it's there's really not, we don't have a definitive answer, right? We only have our own minds, our own intelligence and our own intellect and things to come off of. And so there are a lot of things that are just impossible for us to really grasp and understand. But when you think about the why did God create the universe? But you see little glimpses like in this passage here that I think gives us a little bit of insight so why was God pleased for Christ to dwell fully in a human body, right? We know in Ephesians, at the beginning of the book of Ephesians, Paul talks about the fact that the plan of redemption was before the foundation of the world, right? That God always had this plan that when I create this, and these people, these souls that are eternal, they're going to need to be redeemed in order to come back home to heaven, right? And live eternally here, with me. It blows my mind, when you start wrapping your mind, like, right? But the fact that God created us so that we would have the opportunity to choose to serve him and to be like him and want to be with him. And in order to accomplish that, it was necessary for Jesus to humble himself and to make peace by the blood of his cross.
Yeah, I think that's really, I'm not hinted, it's not the right word because he directly says it, right? But it's there's this idea here that's important of the reason that all the fullness of everything is in Jesus, right? The reason that he's the head of all things, since everything is contained in Jesus, then all things could be reconciled through his work on the cross, right? If there were things that were outside of the scope of Jesus, we would say, then, well, that's outside of being reconciled on the cross, right? He can't reconcile those people, right? Because they're not in his sphere of influence, we might say, right? Using sort of modern terms. But since all is contained in Jesus, right, then all can be reconciled by what he does on the cross, right? And that's really what God's good pleasure is to reconcile all these things back to himself in what he's doing here. And that includes, right, verse 21,
right,
you people who were alienated and hostile and just actively engaged in wickedness against him, right? That includes you too, right? He's now reconciled you also in his body of flesh through his death, right? So that, and not for his good, right? It's so that he could present you before him blameless and holy, right, beyond reproach. If you continue in the faith, so it's for your benefit, and that's where we see this narrowing that we saw before, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus isn't just the reconciler of everyone; he's the reconciler of me, right? It's got to be a personal. We'll say, "Oh, Jesus died for the sins of the world." Great. Right. But don't forget yourself in there. Right. He died for your sins. Right. He reconciled you personally. Don't get so big that you just forget about that. That was for you. Right. And I sometimes think about, this idea that, look, if only one person in the whole scope of human history was ever saved by the work of Jesus and everyone else rejected him. Right. It still would have been sufficient, right? He would have done all that for you, right? Even if everyone else rejected, he still would have done it just for you. And that's the thing we sometimes forget when we go about our lives and we start doing stupid things, right? Is that he died for not just the world, but for you personally. And it was for your good, for your benefit.
Yeah. Well, and I think as we wrap it up here, let's go ahead and just finish up chapter 1 here.
Yeah.
There's, again, we talked about qualifications before. You've been qualified to be partakers of the blessings of God and being called saints and all that. And then he says if you have to continue in the faith, which is going to require you to be stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you've heard. So Paul really is great about making sure that we have these tools to help us, right? It's like the carrot on the stick, kind of a thing. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but the idea of, when they dangle a carrot on a stick in front of an animal, right? That, like a donkey or whatever, that it would continue to go forward because it wants to eat that.
Yeah, it hopes for that thing in front.
Right? Yeah. But so our hope is way better than a carrot, right?
Yeah.
But our hope needs to be, he's going to get on what we'll, not to spoil it too much, but in chapter 3, he says, set your mind on things above, right? So not shifting up, the hope that we're talking about there is the redemption that he previously mentioned, and our being able to be inheritors of all of his blessings. And so we have to be stable and steadfast. We can't be shifting to and fro. We have to be on the narrow path.
Yeah, right. And maybe we'll wrap it up with this thought here, right? That it really goes back to, when you talk about he gives us all the tools and things, right? And God does that as well, because that idea of being stable and steadfast, that should throw us right back to verse 11, right? Where he says, God's going to give you all this strength and all the power of his glorious might so that you can be steadfast, so that you can endure, so that you can. Right. So it's not even you got to do this on your own, right? He's going to give you everything you need to do to make this happen. Exactly. You just got to hold fast to that hope and don't shift these other things, which probably begins to hint at there was some sort of a problem, maybe not specifically in Colossians, but there was some sort of problem beginning of shifting away from the gospel and its hope.
Yep, exactly. All right, well, that wraps up chapter 1, everybody. Hope you're enjoying this. If you would like to continue to get notifications, make sure you subscribe, hit the little bell notification thing, and you'll get notified every time there's a new episode of the podcast. And if you're enjoying this, we'd love to hear your comments, questions down below. The email's also down there if you have anything that you need. Thanks again so much. God bless you all, and until next time, we'll see you then.